James Garfield became the 20th President of the United States on the 4th of March 1881. 4 months later, he was shot in the back at Baltimore train station by Charles Guiteau, a mentally ill office seeker who had been interviewed by the President but was rejected for a job just a few weeks earlier. Guiteau had hoped to become the US ambassador to France. However, having failed to achieve that objective, he bought a gun and shot the President. He shot Garfield in the back, who died from the wounds a few months later. Garfield's death helped to bring about a change in the political system whereby civil servants' jobs were based on exams rather than political connections. Here we take a brief look at Garfield's youth and his background. James Garfield was born in Moreland Hills, Ohio in November 1831. His father Abram had built a log cabin there just a few years earlier. Garfield was therefore the last of the US presidents born in a log cabin. He also holds the unique distinction of being the only sitting member of the House of Representatives who was ever elected as president. Garfield's father died when James was just 2 years old, and therefore his family were often close to poverty. James was a highly intelligent child, however, and his mother encouraged him to get a good education. As a young teenager, he worked in various jobs such as the local canal, as an assistant carpenter and as a part-time teacher. He went to Hiram College in Ohio. Later he left the state and went to Williams College in Massachusetts, where he studied classics and came second in his class. He was a very bright student, and by his mid-20s he had returned to his home state and become professor in classics in Hiram College, where he had just been a student just a few years earlier. In 1858 he married Lucretia Randolph. They had 7 children. She had been a former student of his. Garfield was also highly politically involved in the newly formed Republican Party and was elected to the Ohio State Senate in 1859. In his spare time, he studied law and was called to the Ohio Bar in 1861, so that by the age of 30 he had become a professor, got married, qualified as a lawyer, and was elected to the state senate in his own state of Ohio. However, his life at this stage was about to take a completely different turn. The Civil War began in April 1861, and as a newly elected Republican, Garfield began a campaign to encourage young men to enlist in the Union cause. He spoke at several meetings all over the state of Ohio and was a brilliant, inspirational speaker. By the middle of 1861, he was appointed a colonel in the 42nd Ohio Regiment. They fought Confederate forces in Kentucky and later in the Battle of Middle Creek in January 1862. Garfield, after this, was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. 3 months later, he was involved in the Battle of Shiloh in southwestern Tennessee in April 1862. So that by late 1862, Garfield had become Chief of Staff to General William Rosecrans. Here he played a key role in the Tullahoma campaign. He was later involved in the Union victory at Chattanooga and in Tennessee, and thereafter became a Major General. While Garfield was at the war front, Republicans in Ohio back home selected him to run for Congress, and he won a seat in late 1862. He began his political career as a very strong radical Republican. He wanted to see the big southern states broken up and subdivided among poor white people and also people of colour. He also promoted civil rights and voting rights for people of colour and was in frequent conflict with both Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson in regard to some of these issues. After the Civil War, Garfield became an expert in financial matters in Congress. He was a brilliant congressman and had studied these issues in great detail. He strongly supported a return to the gold standard during the presidency of Ulysses Grant. The expansion of the money supply during the Civil War, where greenback dollars were not backed by gold, had led to a situation where there was a complete oversupply of money and huge inflation. Garfield believed the situation contributed to the many financial scandals in the post-war period. In one famous case that he was slightly involved in himself, the Union Pacific Railway Company created a fake company known as Credit Mobile, which actually artificially inflated prices to such an extent that they robbed taxpayers by overpricing their products to the tune of $40 million. Several politicians and business executives were caught up in such scandals, and Garfield was marginally damaged as a result of being a company shareholder for a brief period. As a congressman after the Civil War, Garfield became an expert in a number of areas, especially in regard to finance, agriculture, and transportation systems. He was a strong supporter of the 15th Amendment, which gave voting rights to people of colour. He was a member of several committees in Congress throughout the 1870s. He supported the civil service reform and argued for an exam system to replace the spoil system based on political connections. However, a significant section of the Republican Party, the stalwart section, continued to support the spoil system. Garfield supported the gold standard and free trade, but this was met with a lot of opposition from Western members of Congress, who supported both a gold and silver-backed dollar in order to expand the money supply and thereby help farmers achieve better prices. As a result of this conflict, Garfield lost his position on the powerful Ways and Means Committee. As the 1880 Republican Convention approached, Garfield was not considered a serious contender for the nomination for president. So he went to the convention in support of fellow Ohioan John Sherman, a far more senior Republican who had just been Secretary of the Treasurer. However, the convention became split between three powerful factions. Ex-President Ulysses Grant represented the stalwart faction, with the support of Roscoe Conkling of New York. James G. Blaine from the state of Maine represented the reformers, and John Sherman from Ohio, like Garfield himself, and had been Secretary of the Treasury, represented a more moderate faction. However, after several days of debates and argument and 35 separate ballots, none of the three could reach the two-thirds quota support necessary in order to win. Delegates were actually very impressed with Garfield's speech nominating Sherman, and so as a result of the deadlock, the convention eventually turned to Garfield as a compromise candidate. Garfield in turn picked Chester Arthur, a stalwart from the stalwart section of the party, as his running mate in an attempt to unify the party. They went on to defeat Winfield Scott Hancock in the November presidential election of 1880. Garfield's cabinet consisted of just 7 secretaries, quite small by today's standards. James G. Blaine, the recent presidential contender, became Secretary of State. William Windom became Secretary of the Treasury, and Robert Todd Lincoln, son of Abraham Lincoln, became Secretary of War. The other 4 secretaries were the Attorney General Wayne McVeigh, the Postmaster General Thomas James, and at the head of the Navy was William H. Hunt, and the Interior Department was headed by Samuel Kirkwood. Chester Arthur, not a member of the cabinet, became the Vice President. Garfield clashed with the stalwart faction of the party at a very early stage. His appointment, for instance, of James Blaine as Secretary of State angered Roscoe Conkling of the stalwart faction. Garfield then appointed William Robertson as Collector of the Port of New York. This was an extremely important financial position. Conkling attempted to block this appointment in the Senate but failed to do so and resigned in protest. This was an important political battle whereby Garfield strengthened the executive power of the presidency relative to the Senate. Garfield also promoted innovation and efficiency in agriculture and hoped to see the United States as a world leader in the export of agricultural products. He had big plans for America. However, it was not to be. After just 4 months as president, on the 2nd of July 1881, Charles Guiteau shot the president in the back at Baltimore railway station. The bullet itself was not fatal, but several doctors inserted their fingers searching for the bullet and thereby infected the president's blood system. American doctors at that time were not aware of the dangers of infection. The great inventor Alexander Bell tried but failed to detect the bullet, partly because of the results of steel springs in the bed and also because wrong information regarding the likely location of the bullet by head doctor Willard Bliss. James R. Garfield died on the 19th of September 1881, just 6 months after becoming president. His death united the nation in grief and gave his successor, Chester Arthur, the necessary political momentum to achieve civil service reform, which had contributed to the president's death. The number of states at this stage in 1881 remained at 38 states, and the population of America was just over 50 million. James Garfield ranks low in relation to his status as an American president, mainly because of his brief period in office. His killer, Charles Guiteau, was hanged 12 months later in June 1882. James Garfield's son, James Rudolph Garfield, also became a lawyer and went on to serve as the Secretary of the Interior in Teddy Roosevelt's administration over 20 years later.